The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this very cold, snowy day for our Shelter Diversion 101 training. I am Amber Freeman, the Training and Technical Assistance Coordinator with the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness. Before we begin this training that we have for you today, I just want to start with some housekeeping. So because this is a webinar, you all are all muted, but you can please type in any questions that you have at any point during the training, and we'll be sure to get to as many questions as possible. Also, this training is being recorded, and the recording as well as the training slides will be available in our webinar library at cceh.org. When you go to our website, you can go on the resource tab and you'll see a tab for webinars. Also, due to the storm that we're having and having a little technical difficulties right now with the internet connection, our cameras are off so that hopefully we don't have any technical issues, but if you would like to see what we look like, feel free to go to our website, www.cceh.org. So for today's training, you have myself, Amber Freeman, again, the Training and Technical Assistance Coordinator, and we also have my colleague, Diana Berube, who is our Program Manager for Prevention and Exit Strategies. Now, although I am the Training and Technical Assistance Coordinator, Diana is our in-house shelter diversion training, and she comes with so much experience and expertise. And Diana, would you like to just give a little bit of introduction and some information on your background?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Amber, and thank you all for joining us today and for your interest in learning about shelter diversion. We've got quite a bit of content to get through today, and we will, like Amber said, leave some room at the end for questions, and feel free to type in any questions that you have during the training into the chat box. A little bit about my experience so that you know where I come from. I have been with the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness for about 1.5 years. I started in the homeless response field more than 5 years ago. My first experience in job position was through the Bristol Board of Education under the McKinney-Vento Federal Act. So those of you that are familiar, that is the federal law that protects students and families that are experiencing unstable housing. From there, I went on to work in Bristol, Connecticut as well, doing some street outreach and working with those that are experiencing literal street homelessness. And I also have years of experience in Central CAN. We'll go over what CAN means in this training. I apologize if we work oftentimes in acronyms in this field, so many of you know that. Doing the in-person assessments for those people that are seeking emergency shelter. So years of experience within the homeless response system in Connecticut, and my focus is on shelter diversion. So I want to give you a little bit about our history, about the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness. We were founded in 1982. We provide a voice for nonprofit organizations, homeless response agencies across the state. Our mission is to prevent and end homelessness in Connecticut. And when we say end homelessness, our vision really is not to believe that no one ever will fall into homelessness again, but that we are making sure that our system is set up to ensure that homelessness for each and every individual and family is rare, brief, and non-recurring. So CCH roles and functions, we provide quite a bit with throughout the state of Connecticut. We administer the statewide administrative data system, which is HMIS, many of you might be familiar with. Within that database, we conduct quite a bit of analysis and research that informs our practices and policies statewide, helps us to advocate for more dollars to assist those of our providers and members across the state in the frontline work that you all are doing. We provide training and technical assistance again, to our members and homeless providers across the state to implement best practices. We work really hard in educating our elected officials, our legislative offices, state and federal, again, to provide them with the data, to provide them with the advocacy that we need to get the resources that are needed to end homelessness in our state. We also provide community impact, so that's a lot of our local collaboration within our members, within nonprofits, within our homeless provider agencies to give you guys support, provide staff support, ensure quality. And lastly, we also administer flexible financial assistance, which we're going to talk about at the end of this training a little bit. Our flexible financial assistance started out with the Homeful campaign and has broadened quite a bit within the past year. Our agenda for this afternoon, again, we have quite a bit of content to go through. We're going to discuss what shelter diversion is as a practice, why shelter diversion is important work, a specific focus on the changes that have happened within the past 6 to 9 months due to the current pandemic. The how-tos is really important on how to do effective shelter diversion. We'll talk a little bit about resource mapping in your local communities. And then lastly, how to access our flexible financial assistance programs. So we're going to start off with the basics of shelter diversion. When we say shelter diversion, a lot of people immediately think of, the flexible assistance, the shelter diversion location sites that we have across the state. But really, when we're talking about shelter diversion, we're talking about a strategy. Shelter diversion is really rooted in a problem-solving conversation, and the folks that we're targeting and trying to assist within shelter diversion are those that are in immediate need of emergency shelter, or those that are on the brink of experiencing literal homelessness. And when I say literal, that is living in a car or a place that's not meant for human habitation. And we're trying to connect those folks with services, possibly some financial assistance, helping them to develop a long-term housing plan in order to divert them from homelessness before they experience it. So this slide is important to explain the Connecticut homeless response system. It's an overview of the Coordinated Access Network. So when we speak of CAN, that is an acronym for Coordinated Access Network. And our state is broken up into 7 regions across the state. The next slide will show you those regions specifically. So we have one hotline across the state for anybody that is either experiencing homelessness or is on the brink of homelessness that is in need of assistance. That hotline is 211. So anybody that needs help can reach out by calling 211. They will receive some assistance from a call specialist. That call specialist will spend a few minutes on the phone with them, discussing what their housing crisis is and how we might be able to help them as a system. Ideally, at that point, it's a quick conversation. The call specialist is able to problem solve quickly and come up with some solutions, and the client can be diverted pretty quickly. If the diversion at that point in that short phone call is not an option, the client or family or household will then be scheduled for a CAN assessment. Those are scheduled region specific across the state. Pre-pandemic, those appointments were happening in person at diversion centers. Within the last, months, we've had to change up our system a little bit, and most, if not all, of those assessments are now happening virtually and by phone. That conversation then with a CAN diversion specialist is a deeper dive into a diversion strategy and problem-solving conversation. So the diversion specialist will talk with the client and household about what their natural supports are, what their barriers to housing are, and help them kind of troubleshoot what some solutions might be. At that point, the client or household is then either diverted from homelessness with, possibility of some referrals to other resources, or they may end up entering emergency shelter. The percentage of those folks that are actually coming from a CAN assessment and entering an emergency shelter is small right now. We're doing our very best statewide to keep people from having to go to an emergency shelter simply because it is a congregate setting and we want to keep people safe. So we're really doing everything that we can to keep people stably housed without needing shelter. In some instances where emergency shelter is not available, diversion does not happen, we would go to this prioritized for shelter category. So currently we are running statewide some wait lists for shelter. Those wait lists are not just adding a name to a list of people that need emergency shelter that are sleeping outdoors, but it is prioritized based on a number of different factors. We want to make sure that the most vulnerable, the most needy people are able to access. At that point, if we have to place somebody on a wait list, there is a referral that can be made to an outreach worker to make sure that people are remaining connected with our homeless response system and can still receive services that are needed. They can access interventions for housing. So the interventions that might be available to some people can be something as simple as short-term financial assistance with no case management, to a rapid rehousing program where they may receive a few months of rental assistance with case management, all the way to those folks that are maybe very disabled, very limited income or no income at all, and still in need of housing that might qualify for what we call a permanent supportive housing program. In order to access any of those financial assistance programs, a client would either need to be entering into an emergency shelter, be connected to a homeless outreach worker, and those case managers would have conducted what we call a VI SPDAT, which is basically a vulnerability survey that would get them onto what we call our by name list. That is a list of all the people across Connecticut that we are aware of that are experiencing homelessness, that are in need of housing interventions. I think it's really important to note that when we're talking about shelter diversion, even though this is a broad spectrum of our system overview, diversion conversations begin at the very front door with the first call to 211, but continue for anyone that follows this path through the system at the CAN assessment. It's the same housing focused conversation that we're having, same housing focused conversation that an outreach worker would be having, same housing focused conversation that a shelter case manager were having. So diversion spans across the whole spectrum of our CAN system overview. So this is the map of Connecticut that shows the breakdown of our coordinated access networks. We are broken down by Fairfield County, Greater New Haven CAN, Meriden, Middlesex, Wallingford, Waterbury, Litchfield, which we are now calling the Northwest CAN. Central CAN is that pink in the very small in the middle of the state. Greater Hartford CAN is the lighter green in the top middle of the state, and the entire right-hand side of the state is our Eastern CAN. I think it's important to note the change in with setting up our CAN system. Prior to that happening, what was in place was people coming from all different community partners and looking for emergency shelter. The solution seemed to be shelter. And now our focus has shifted from, if you're in need of services, shelter's not our first option. Our first option is to talk about housing solutions. So we've worked really hard within the past few years to educate our community partners, our schools, Department of Children and Families, our criminal justice system, municipalities, social service agencies, early childhood providers and hospitals on the practice of shelter diversion. And so that our first thought for folks that are in need of housing solutions is not to go straight to an emergency shelter, but to think about what our other housing solutions might be. That brings us to the why. Why do we do shelter diversion? And I think that this is my favorite part of this presentation, actually, and I think it's really crucial in why I'm passionate about the work that we do. So shelter diversion prevents experiences of homelessness. When you use the word homeless, you think about different levels of housing crisis, but each one of those can be a trauma in and of itself. And if we can help folks keep from experiencing that trauma, then the harder work happens at the front door in order to help people from avoiding that. Secondly, it's a better utilization of resources. So emergency shelter might be free to those folks that need it, but it is costly for our state. It's cost effective. It's a better utilization of what we have available for folks. Again, homelessness can be a trauma in and of itself, especially for children that have to enter shelter with their families. And it reduces the repeat experiences of homelessness.
So as Diana said, there's many reasons as to why we do shelter diversion, and I just want to speak a little bit more of the reasons to implement diversion. Now, it improves our system outcomes by reducing the entries into homelessness. The goal for our outcomes is to have a reduction in the inflow and instead increase our outflow. Also to decrease the average length of homelessness and decrease the returns to homelessness. And diversion is something that can assist with all of those outcomes. Also, we want to improve the quality of life by helping people avoid the stress of shelter stays. As Diana already said, it can be traumatizing to be in a shelter, and being in a shelter can re-traumatize someone. And we want to avoid that as much as possible. We want to conserve and target resources where having someone go to a shelter is the last resort. We want to exhaust every other option possible before getting a shelter bed. We also want to cut down on shelter wait lists, and having a strong diversion practice is something that can help with doing that. Shelter wait lists is not truly a outcome. You know, it's putting someone on a wait list. It doesn't help with the system flow at all. It doesn't help to reduce the inflow, and it doesn't help to increase the outflow. Instead, it's just putting someone on a wait list. So we are housing focused, we're solution focused, and putting someone on a shelter wait list doesn't help with that. But shelter diversion can help with that. It's giving them an outcome and an option to find a means to housing.
Thank you, Amber. Yeah, so when we talk about shelter wait lists and we talk about, somebody who's presenting within housing crisis and in a traumatic situation, to say to someone, the only option that I have for you right now, that I don't have immediate solutions, the only thing I can do is put you on a shelter wait list, is not only not beneficial to our system, but not beneficial and not helpful in that moment or in the housing crisis for that person. So we want to talk a little bit about the cost effectiveness of diversion. Again, shelter stays while they can be free for those that need them, are costly to our state. While mediation and maybe a small one-time financial assistance can be something that we can provide quickly, efficiently, and at a smaller cost to our system to help folks come up with housing solutions. There are on occasions where we're able to provide people with, for example, a Greyhound bus ticket for a minimal cost, where they can identify natural supports maybe that are out of state or close by, but they just need a chance to get to them. There are other assistance that we can provide, like utility bills. Sometimes we can provide some rental assistance, and all of that's going to be much cheaper than, like I stated, our rapid rehousing programs that can be upwards of $5,000 per client. A shelter bed or a Section 8 subsidy is going to be costly to Connecticut's housing system. And street homelessness can also put a strain on our emergency services, such as our criminal justice system and hospitalizations. So we talk about homelessness as being a trauma. In my experience, and I'll bring it back to what I've experienced in the field, especially in doing street outreach and working with those that are literally homeless, meeting somebody for the first time that's on the brink of homelessness, they present in a certain way. And as you work with somebody that's experiencing homelessness over a period of time, you will tend to see a deterioration in that person's health. And that's not just their physical health, but their mental health and how they present. For children, this is really important. That a child entering shelter with their family has a greater prediction of negative health outcomes. That could be anything from asthma to ear infections to hospitalizations. And I think the key takeaway here in this traumatic experience for children, and this is not to say that this is across the board for every child, but it's a trend, and it's a thing that we have data to prove, that children that experience homelessness at a younger age are more likely to experience homelessness in the future. So it's a predictor of future episodes. So when we can stop a family or a household when they're at the brink, keep them from experiencing that homelessness episode to begin with, we're going to stop that trend for a family in the future. So I want to talk a little bit about what an emergency shelter is and what its function is, why it's needed and when it's needed. And I use this picture because I think it's really telling. This is not what every emergency shelter in Connecticut looks like, but it is what many of them do look like. We have single men's dorms, we have single females dorms, and we have space for families. Oftentimes, it looks like this, where there are bunk beds side by side, very little privacy. And so I'll let you, Amber, go to the next slide so we can talk a little bit about some of the other shelter realities. We're going to talk a little bit about what our housing first principle is, but essentially it means that regardless of what anybody's mental health issues might be, their physical health issues might be, what other problems that they're experiencing in their life, that every person deserves the right to housing before we try to fix all of those other problems. It should be the first puzzle piece, because a roof over your head is going to help with all of the rest of it. We use that same housing first principle when we're talking about emergency shelters. So anybody that needs emergency shelter should be able to access it. So we make sure, and we've changed a lot of our practices across the state within the last few years to make sure that all of our shelters are as low barrier as possible. One of those changes is that the shelters in Connecticut are now what we call wet shelters. And that means that folks that are experiencing active substance abuse are allowed to enter shelter, lay their head at night, and receive the services that we can provide to them to solve their housing crisis. I think that's important to note because it changes the atmosphere of what an emergency shelter might look like. While they have lots of rules and policies and safety precautions, anybody that is creating an unsafe situation for themselves or somebody else may be asked to leave, or safety is the first priority. But we do have folks in shelter that are actively using an array of substances. And I think that there's a misconception about what a shelter is and what its function is and what the atmosphere is. And I think it's important to note what a wet shelter actually is before thinking that that might be your only option. Especially for those folks that may be coming out of a recovery program, leaving a discharge from a hospital. It's something to take into account. And I think it's important in our diversion conversation. Again, there's very little privacy. There are shelters that have minimal staffing. There are hours of operations. It looks a little bit different these days because we are living through a pandemic and we have instances where we have to allow people to stay in all day or quarantine. But typically, the hours of operation of a shelter is that folks are allowed to come in at night, lay their head down to sleep, and are required to leave in the morning. We've talked about the traumatic experience that it can be for some folks, not all, but some folks. And lastly, I think we really have to really hit this message. It needs to be first and foremost at the current moment, because of the pandemic, that it is a congregate setting, and we're really trying to make sure that we're keeping as many folks from having to enter congregate settings for their health and safety. So we look at the coordinated assessment similarly to the way that we would look at somebody walking into an emergency room for the first time. So that first call to 211 and the subsequent scheduling of an appointment for a coordinated access network assessment, CAN assessment. We're thinking about that the same way that somebody who walks into an emergency room is going to get triaged. So you may walk into an emergency room because you sprained your ankle and you need some assistance and you need a bandage, or you need some doctor to check you out. Or you may walk into an emergency room because you're having a heart attack. And those two people are going to get assessed and treated in very different ways. And I think it's important to kind of view our homeless response system in the same way, in that each and every individual that's experiencing a housing crisis has a different level of crisis. So there might be, the person with a sprained ankle might just need an ACE bandage. The person that's experiencing a heart attack is going to need a cardiac specialist and is going to need to be admitted to the hospital right away. Housing crisis is kind of, the analogy is that there are some folks that we can assist with just that simple problem-solving conversation. There are some people that may need just a short-term financial assistance, but there are some people that are going to need a full scope of services and long-term financial assistance. So I like this analogy because it really gives us a focus on what housing crisis means and the different levels of intervention that are available to folks. So that brings us to the word homeless. What does homeless mean? And people use that word in varying levels. Again, different levels of housing crisis. So what we talk about is literal homelessness. That may be somebody that you have this picture of, visual in your head, of somebody who's sleeping out on the street with a cardboard box, or standing by the road with a cardboard sign that says, "I'm homeless, I need help, please." But literal homelessness can also mean living in a place that's not meant for human habitation. So that could be sleeping in your car, sleeping in an abandoned building, anything where there's not running water, access to hygiene, access to basic needs. So that's not meant for human habitation. That is what we discuss as literal homelessness. The gray area in the term homelessness comes in what we call imminent homelessness. So that is somebody who is at the risk of losing their housing within a very brief period of time. So they might be facing an eviction, or they might be living with family or friends and someone's about to kick them out of the home. They may not know exactly when that's going to happen, but that is what we discuss as imminent homelessness. So those different levels of homelessness, those different definitions of homelessness are, we go by the HUD categories. So that is Housing and Urban Development, the federal definitions of homelessness. So category 1 is literal homelessness that we just discussed, those that are living in a place not meant for human habitation. The gray area here is between category 2 and category 3 under federal statutes. The imminent homelessness is at risk of losing their housing within 14 days. No subsequent residence has been identified, no natural supports. The household is about to be on the street or without any other options. Category 3 is homeless under other federal statutes. So the definitions of homelessness change if you look at HUD versus within our education system. And category 3 often encompasses those that are couch surfing, which we're going to talk about next a little bit. So what is couch surfing? Many people will present to their CAN appointment or present to the first call to 211 and say, I'm homeless. And what they're really saying is, I don't have my own home. I don't hold a lease in my name. I don't have my own bed to rest my head on. But they might be couch surfing. So that can be anything from frantically calling friends, family on a day-to-day basis and saying, can I come and please stay with you for one night, to a more stable couch surfing situation where you might have a family or friend that's willing to help you out, and it's short term, anywhere up to a month maybe. And so I think it's important to identify that there are distinctions in couch surfing, that it can be a severe housing crisis to a more stable couch surfing situation. And those that are a little bit more stable in their couch surfing tend to have more opportunities to problem solve and come up with stable solutions in an easier conversation. That brings us to the how-to. How do we do effective shelter diversion? How do we have those problem-solving conversations? And how do we help folks in housing crisis? The key to effective shelter diversion strategy and problem solving is to create a safe space for the client, the household, to speak openly. So pre-pandemic, having these in-person appointments, it was a lot of things, you know, about your waiting room and your body language and how you're presenting yourself to the client, your facial expressions, making sure that you're being, you know, very non-judgmental. In this day and age where most of our conversations are happening by phone, it is important that, you know, you briefly introduce yourself. If it's somebody that you're meeting for the first time and not a client that you've been working with for a period, introducing yourself, making them feel comfortable with you. So, you know, your name, identifying yourself by your first name and speaking to the client, addressing them by their first name can bridge that trust level pretty quickly. So your organization, your role, asking permission to have the conversation. Is it okay with you if we talk about some things that might be uncomfortable? I'm going to ask you some questions that might be very personal. we're going to talk about your housing crisis. Are you okay with having this conversation? And really setting the stage for a safe space to talk. Within that comfort level, it's important that we're always trying to remain trauma informed. And we've talked about homelessness being a trauma within itself, but many people that are either experiencing literal homelessness or on the brink of homelessness have experienced their own trauma prior to. And that could be anything from domestic violence to substance abuse issues, but trauma in itself. And so when we're having these conversations, making sure that we're remaining trauma informed in those conversations is key. So ensuring that there is physical and emotional safety for the client, presenting with a level of trustworthiness, making sure that tasks are clear, maintaining appropriate boundaries, always trying to be client center focused, thinking about what the client's choices are and prioritizing their choices. It's a collaboration and a sharing of power, so that in those conversations, it's a back and forth where we're listening, understanding what the client would like to have happen, what they think their resolution to their housing crisis is, and being empowering. It's also a level of cultural responsiveness and taking into account that our own experiences may differ greatly from the person that we're speaking with, what their gender issue is, if they're LGBTQ, what their historical and cultural background is, and making sure that we're really remaining trauma informed.
So diversion and having those conversations is something that, as we already said, should happen right at the front door. It's an approach right at coordinated entry, and it's just shifting your mindset about how you go into it. Instead of thinking that you just want to find out what program someone is eligible to enter and finding out, what shelter has a bed available, you instead want to think about and ask the client what will resolve their current housing crisis. You want to be housing focused and solution focused from the very beginning. Instead of thinking about, okay, let me just do this assessment and find out what are they eligible for. Instead, when you're having shelter diversion conversations and practices, you want to have a structured problem solving conversation where you are speaking about their current housing situation, listening to see what's really going on, and being able to provide them with some type of resource or resolution. Also, as we already said, instead of completing a intake and just putting someone on a wait list, we instead want to support the crisis and find some type of resolution to avoid shelter entry. We don't want to put someone on a shelter wait list. We want to avoid having someone having to go into a shelter. Instead, we want to see what other options are available, what resources are available, how can I assist in this housing crisis. So as Diane already said, shelter diversion is a conversation. It is not something that is one-sided. Instead, it's a conversation between the provider and the person that is experiencing the housing crisis. The person that's experiencing the housing crisis, they're sharing their story. They're telling you what is going on with them, what their current situation looks like, maybe what their past experiences consist of. And as a provider, you're listening. And as you're listening, you're also identifying natural supports and resources to help them through the crisis. You're identifying and highlighting their strengths to say, okay, they have these strengths. This is something that worked for them before. This is something that they have that they can rely on. Let's highlight those strengths, and hopefully those strengths will be enough to eliminate the housing crisis. You're also providing information and guidance, and you're doing myth busting and reality testing to see what's really going on, what their perception is, and how you can help to provide some type of resolution. And the person that's in the housing crisis, they're developing their own housing plan. We provide services that are client driven. So it is extremely important that they provide their own housing plan and tell you, what they see for themselves. They're asking questions to see what their options are, or how you can assist them. And they're also taking the steps with guidance if necessary, but they're taking the steps to secure and maintain permanent housing. So it's both sides. It's the provider doing their part, and then the person in the housing crisis working on their end, and together coming up with a resolution to divert going into the shelter.
So some of the questions that you might want to start to frame this conversation with is when you begin the conversation with that person that presents and says, I need help. So can you tell me why you're seeking emergency shelter? What other things have you tried or thought about trying in order to solve your crisis? How long have you been staying where you've been staying at? Is there a primary reason or why you might need to leave the place that you've been sleeping or the housing situation that you're currently in? Are there any additional reasons why you can't stay where you're at? Where did you stay prior to? So if you've only been staying with a friend or family member for a couple of days or a short period of time, maybe a week, looking into the housing history that the person presents with. Are there resources that we could provide or help you, refer you to, that could help you maintain the housing that you're in right now? Could we extend the temporary housing by providing some of those resources? So these are just some of like the framework questions that you're going to start with, and then based on the person that's presenting in crisis and how they respond to those questions is how you're going to frame the conversation.
And so
Go ahead, Amber. Thanks.
that's fine. As you're having the conversation with someone, and they're telling their story, some may hear, some barriers to housing. And I have that in quotes because we like to believe there's no true barriers to housing. All of our housing programs follow a housing first principle. That is basically the belief that housing is a basic necessity that must be prioritized before an individual can pursue other personal goals and work towards improving their quality of life, which is basically, although someone may have low income or a lack of family or friends or be actively using substance abuse, mental illness, a pet owner, none of that truly matters. There are still options for housing, and we are going to focus on providing some type of housing resolution, securing some type of housing, because we have to get them in a place where that basic need can be met, right? And then once they're housed, then they can work on these other areas. So I also have pet owner on there because that's something that oftentimes you don't really think about when you're trying to do diversion. You think of just the person, but being a pet owner can be difficult because they cannot bring pets to their family or friends, or maybe they don't have enough funds for a security deposit, or as they're looking for housing, they need somewhere to put their pet. But we also want to change the narrative that pets are a barrier to housing. Just to give a little bit of information, we do currently have a grant that we got through PetSmart, where we're assisting individuals that do have pets, because we understand that it is difficult to find housing when you have a pet. So maybe someone just needs a security deposit. Maybe someone needs to just put their pet in boarding while they take advantage of a housing opportunity. So for all of these so-called barriers to housing, there are other options that you can assist someone with finding. There's other resources out there. But Diana, I think you had some other things you wanted to add to that.
No, I think you captured it perfectly, Amber. It's just really trying to maintain housing focused. And oftentimes when we think of the word homeless and we think of the why people end up in that situation, um, people point to criminal record, people point to mental illness, people point to substance abuse. And we really try to change the narrative, change the way we talk about people experiencing homelessness, and making sure that we're really seeing people first, that the person presenting in front of you that is in need of help is a person and not a person with mental illness, and not a person who has a dog that they can't find a landlord for, or not a person that you view as a substance abuse user. That we're really client choice and client centered, and that we're really seeing the people that present to us. And I say this really often, but I say it with conviction every time I say it, that every single person that touches our homeless response system in the state of Connecticut should always be treated with the same level of respect and dignity. And I think when we're thinking about barriers to housing, that's really key in the conversation. So some of the techniques that we use in our problem solving conversations, and there are a wealth of resources out there and other trainings that you can attend to hone in your skills on some of these techniques. But the problem solving conversation is going to work really well and be really effective if you practice, first off, active and empathetic listening. And I appreciate all of you that are on this call today, that are listening to our webinar, even though it is virtual. Pre-pandemic, when I really miss being able to be in a room with people and seeing all of your faces and really getting to interact with you. But one of the exercises that we used to do in an in-person training is an active and empathetic listening exercise. It's easy to think that you might be a good listener, and I am guilty of this myself, but really honing in that skill of being non-judgmental, not offering advice quickly, not talking over somebody, really being the listener is really important. And it seems like an easy task, but it can be difficult, especially when someone presents with such a high level of crisis, where we think, and you may have a wealth of experience in your toolkit with other people that may have experienced, a similar housing crisis, and it's easy to jump to some conclusions and say, well, this is what I think you have to do. Active and empathetic listening takes a step back, and as the provider, your job is to listen. Your job is to let the client talk. And when you do that, the client's going to present to you with more and more pieces of their puzzle and more options that they've even already thought of to resolve their housing crisis. And you're going to get that information that's going to give you what you need for action steps to resolve the crisis. Another thing to take into account, and I think, I touched on this in really trying to make sure that we're treating everybody with the same level of respect and dignity, is checking your own personal bias. So really understanding the difference between explicit bias, and that might be something that you have on your conscious level, to implicit bias, which is something in your subconscious. And being somebody that is, I'll self-profess that I'm a very open-minded, non-judgmental person, but everybody has a small level of bias within them. And if you can check that bias before you start interacting with people that are in that level of crisis, it's going to help you in your work. There is implicit bias test that I encourage you to take, that was set up by the Harvard School of Law. So you can take a look at that. The website is here for your reference. So again, it's really just kind of like taking a step back, recognizing that you haven't walked in someone else's shoes. And I have to laugh a little bit because I always love to include this slide, but it really speaks to my heart. And I think, you know, Fred Rogers being one of my like idols, it says that love isn't a state of perfect caring. It is an active noun like struggle. To love someone is to strive to accept that person exactly the way he or she is, right here and now. And I use this quote because people that are presenting in crisis may be aggressive. They might yell at you. They might say, you're not providing me the help that I need. But that level of crisis changes how somebody is interacting. And this quote to me just speaks to really meeting clients where they're at. To understand what it means to meet clients where they're at doesn't mean that we have to love everyone, doesn't mean that we have to have pleasant interactions at every stage of crisis intervention, but it does mean that we have to take a step back and make sure that we're really seeing this as a struggle that we're going through together, and really understanding how to meet someone where they're at. That brings us to highlighting a person's strengths. And again, if somebody is presenting in crisis and they're already agitated and they have maybe told their story to 3 other people before you, or they've been to their mental health provider already and they've had to share their personal struggles, highlighting strengths can be a difficult thing to do, but it's crucial and it's really important and can be very empowering in our problem solving conversations. So some things to talk about with a client, helping them to identify times when maybe they have been the person that has been the support. Who have you helped in the past? Are there other friends or family members or allies that you can go to and say, hey, in the past, you know, we worked together, I've really been able to support you, or now I'm in my time of need, and can I come to you for assistance? It's really identifying the client's networks, support people, making them feel a little more independent, but also interdependent with their natural supports. Another technique that we use in problem solving conversations, and I'll let Amber speak a little bit because we've got some trainings that we've done recently and upcoming as well, but motivational interviewing can really change the course of the conversation. So it's about asking open-ended questions. So something like, are you looking for a job? The answer to that question is either a yes or a no. But if you say instead, tell me about your job search, you're going to get a whole lot more detail from the client, and it's going to open up the conversation in a different way. Motivational interviewing also focuses on affirming positive behaviors, listening reflectively. So that is not just the active and empathetic listening, but really making sure that you're letting the client know that they're heard, that they've that you're understanding what they're telling them. And the way to do that also is by summarizing. Some do's and don'ts in motivational interviewing, and we'll just touch upon this briefly. Again, there's a wealth of motivational interviewing training that you can take, and it's not really just that one-time training, but it's really an ongoing skill that can be honed and practiced. But some do's in motivational interviewing are, again, explaining what the conversation is going to be about, asking permission to discuss someone's personal background, focusing on understanding that person's worldview that might be very different from yours. Some don'ts, do not give advice. And this is a difficult thing to do, especially if you've had a lot of experience in the field and you know what resources might be available. And those are all great things, but it can come off as judgmental. Don't try to solve the problem for the person. It's really important to be client-centered, client choice-driven, listening to what they think is the solution. When the client comes up with their own plan with supports from the provider, they're more likely to follow through and take those action steps that are needed because it's their ideas. Making sure that you're not being distracted while you're speaking with the person, and definitely not speaking over them or cutting them off.
Yes, motivational interviewing is definitely one that is extremely highly effective, and it can create so much change in someone, but the change comes from them. You know, instead of, oftentimes we try to motivate our clients, we make attempts, but sometimes it seems as though we're not going anywhere. Why? It's because we're telling them. You know, we may say you need to get a job, or you should treat your mental health, or do this. No one wants to be told what to do, but with motivational interviewing, it is a way to help them realize that they should make this change for themselves. They want this type of life. You know, it's them envisioning how they see themselves and realizing that I need to make this change within myself so I can get the result out of my life that I want. Um, and it's highly effective. We do have trainings on it. We had a training a few weeks ago, and I realized that this is a practice that, although it is extremely highly effective, some people really don't practice it enough. So we are bringing more motivational interviewing trainings. We will be having a one-on-one training where it's very interactive, as well as a part two, because motivational interviewing is not just a practice where you just read a book. You know, it's something that you truly have to practice. So the training involves role playing, really having those conversations, really changing your thought process and how you're interacting with someone else. So stay tuned for that. That was my little training plug. But I strongly encourage all of you all to look more into motivational interviewing because it's extremely effective.
Thanks, Amber. Yeah, I have to put that plug in because I really do encourage this training. I think it really can change the way that conversations can be had. It's really, really highly effective. So here are some responses to motivational interviewing. When it's done well, the person in crisis is going to feel understood. They're going to feel accepted. They will be more willing to follow the plan that you collaborate on. They will have feelings of hopefulness, and they'll stay engaged with you because they feel trust. When motivational interviewing is done poorly, the client's going to feel judged, maybe disrespected. They'll be less likely to follow the plan because it's your plan and not theirs. They may shift backwards towards hopelessness, and they're going to put up a wall and disengage with you. So moving forward, we've practiced our listening skills. We've practiced motivational interviewing. We've made sure that we are trauma informed, and the problem solving conversation has come to an end. Where do we go from here? What do we want to pursue? So moving forward, it's coming up with what we call a housing stabilization plan. So that might mean going back to live with friends or family. It might mean that the client is returning to their own residence. They may be very, very temporarily diverted for a couple of days, even a couple of weeks, while they seek a new housing situation. Or they may, on some occasions, relocate out of town to a safe and more permanent place with other support systems that they might have identified. Some diversion outcomes or housing possibilities that can come from this problem solving conversation, and these are just a few. We really, really encourage creative problem solving. So this is not cookie cutter. We try to make sure that we take each client again as the person that presents in front of you. But these are some of the common outcomes that we've identified. So relying on, again, family or natural supports as someone that can provide a roof over the person in crisis over their head, returning to or getting their own residence. Sober living homes can be an option. They may be temporarily diverted. And again, so it might be that you have to come up with a very short-term plan while you're working on a longer-term resolution. They may be relocating to somewhere else, or you might be able to identify some shared housing options, and those can be really great avenues for stability in housing. So we want to talk a little bit about each one of those, and I think it's really important. I like this slide. While it is a little bit wordy, I'll give you a minute to kind of read through some of it, but there are some concerns that can be addressed when you are talking about, that couch surfing situation, when you're talking about what we call a doubled up situation where somebody is relying on family or friends to stay with. While we want to make sure that we're trauma informed in our conversations, there are some questions that you can ask that can shed a little bit more light on what the situation is. So asking about sleeping arrangements. In my experience, somebody might say, well, my aunt will let me stay with them, but you have a deeper dive into the conversation, you find out aunt only has a studio apartment, there's not even a couch to sleep on, and the client is sleeping on the floor. Well, that's very different than a more stable doubled up situation. And finding out that information can help you inform what the plan needs to be going forward. What is the physical space? Is there running water? Is the plumbing reliable? Are there infestation issues? Especially for families with young children, is there drug or alcohol abuse in the home? And again, you have to, take a step back, read where the client is presenting to you in their responses, and making sure that within any of these questions that there's a comfort level and they're responsive to answering. Remaining trauma informed is crucial in any of these conversations, but these questions can help us get to the root of the barriers to housing and how we can better assist in coming up with a stable plan for the folks that need help.
Due to us currently being in a pandemic, there's also some special considerations that we have to have because of COVID. So we want to go a step further with those questions as well as more, and ask if the individual as well as anyone else in the home, if they, the basic health screening questions, if they have a fever, if they have a new or worsening cough or a shortness of breath, or have a difficult time breathing. You want to ask if they have any contact with someone who was sick in the past 14 days, them, as well as anyone else that lives in the residence. And you also want to ask if they have any health conditions, or if anyone else has any health conditions, because you want to protect the individual as well as the other person that they are living in the residence with. So, of course, we want to encourage social distancing, having them, have a plan with the person that they're doubled up with to see, are they being safe? Are they around other people during the day? Are they wearing their face mask? Making sure that they're not, right on top of each other. Maybe they have separate rooms, or if they're on the couch, it's a safe difference. They have their own areas within the house. There's so many things that you have to consider because of COVID. And lastly, just encourage them to wash their hands regularly. But due to COVID, there are additional questions that we should ask to take it a step further to make sure that it is a healthy doubled up situation, as healthy as it can be for the individual as well as the person that is allowing them for them to stay with.
Yeah, so those special health considerations, I think the same way that we talk about, we'd never want to have to put somebody on a shelter wait list, but when we do, we're going to prioritize. So those health conditions, pre-existing conditions, those people that are elderly, we want to take some special considerations there that make sure that we're helping people in the most appropriate way. So that brings us to, some of these housing options, once we've identified a housing plan, there are some key components that can go into some of these possibilities. So when it's staying with family and friends, this can require a little bit of mediation on our part. So the provider, yourself, or if you're just meeting somebody for the first time, it might be a little more difficult, but oftentimes family and friends, when it's a living situation as such, the reason that they're being kicked out is because of some conflict. It could be that there are, house rules that the client's not following. It could be emotional abuse. It could be, on some occasions, like some domestic violence. And we want to really be sensitive to those issues. But when it's something simple where they're just, in argument with each other and it's just not comfortable, well, the level of comfort and staying with a family or friend that you're just not getting along with is going to be very different from the level of comfort that you're going to experience if you have to enter an emergency shelter. So when we can, with the client's permission, can we offer a little bit of mediation? Can we sit with you and have a three-way call with the family or friend that you've been staying with, maybe to expel some myths about what emergency shelter is for, and to let them know that, a congregate shelter setting is not the safest place for somebody right now, or to let the family or natural supports know that an emergency shelter is not a solution. It's a temporary solution. It doesn't really fix a housing crisis. So some mediation can take place from the provider's end of things in order to help somebody, assist them in either staying more long-term with a family or friend, or even just to extend a stay while we work on some other housing options. If it's the case that the client or the person in housing crisis is currently renting their own unit and they've got some, maybe they're facing an eviction or they're having some trouble with their landlord, again, we can help people stay in their own residence with the possibility of a different kind of mediation. So that might be, can I speak with your landlord? Can we work out if you have, rental arrearages? Can you work out a payment plan? Is there some education that we can provide both to the tenant and landlord on fair housing laws that can mediate and resolve the housing crisis? And lastly, on occasion, there may be some flexible funding that can assist the client to return to their own residence and regain some stability. If we're talking about being temporarily diverted, and again, that can mean a couple of nights to anywhere to a couple of months, when it's a natural support, it's changing the conversation that you're having with them. So family and friends are going to be more susceptible to providing support if they know that there's a time frame of the stay. So if you can, change the conversation to, teaching the client and coaching them to say, instead of, can I come and live with you? Can I come and stay with you for a couple of weeks? In the meantime, here are the action steps X, Y, and Z that I will be taking. And I have confidence that I'm going to have my own housing resolution within that time period. So family or friends are going to be more likely to say, yes, I will support you during this time, if they know that there's kind of a light at the end of the tunnel. Within that kind of conversation, when there is the option for flexible funding assistance, that can also reduce the time spent with natural support. So we all know that housing can be expensive, coming up with the upfront costs to rent your own unit. Oftentimes landlords are asking for a security deposit and first month's rent. During our current state of things within the state of Connecticut, and many of you know that there's a current eviction moratorium, which is preventing landlords from evicting folks. On the flip side of that, landlords may be a little more weary to rent to folks that have evictions on their record, that have criminal background, that have poor credit. And so we are seeing a trend where landlords are asking for double security deposits, for instance. And so when there is an option for flexible funding assistance, instead of telling somebody, go stay with your friends and family while you save up all this extra money so that you can sign a lease, it reduces the time spent, and that can be a really helpful tool. Another option, and we want to talk through what this actually means, is relocating out of town. This shouldn't be a go-to. It should be, again, client-centered. So they're presenting and saying, you know, I have, for instance, a cousin that lives in New York. We've always been close, but I haven't connected with him in a year, you know, but I think he would let me come and stay with him. You should only help somebody relocate to a place out of town when you can verify that there is safe and stable housing on the other end of the trip. So we have assisted providers across the state on occasion with purchasing Greyhound tickets, bus tickets. There was even an example from a few years back where we had a family that I had come here from China, and the housing crisis, like it wasn't working, and they wanted to go back to their supports in China, and the provider was actually able to purchase plane tickets to get them back home. So it's something to think about. There are some logistics that need to be worked out if this is going to be your option. So thinking about not just purchasing a ticket, but making sure that the trip is going to be safe. Thinking about things like, how long is the trip going to be? What luggage is needed? How are they going to get their belongings with them? Thinking about food security during the trip, so that if you need to purchase, you know, a prepaid gift card, so they can, the person can purchase food along the way. These are things to think about when you're not only verifying from the natural support that the person can stay with them, but thinking about the trip logistics as well. Another thing to think about when this is going to be an option is whether or not the person on the other end of the stable housing arrangement has a housing subsidy of their own. Oftentimes natural supports will say, yes, I definitely want to help my family or friends, but then you get to the other end of the trip and find out that, you know, maybe they have Section 8, or they have some subsidized housing, and the landlord that they're renting from will not allow them to have guests living for any extended period of time. So it's just something else to kind of keep in consideration. One of the other housing possibilities, and we've talked, you know, we mentioned shared housing as an arrangement that can work out, specifically for those folks that are really on very limited income. So I bring up people like somebody that might be on Social Security income or disability income. Last I knew, that was still $771 a month. That may have changed in the past couple of months, but $771 a month is not enough for somebody to pay a rent and have stable housing. So shared housing can be a great option for some people that are living at the poverty level. When we are discussing that as a possibility, there's some things that need to be worked through. So to provide some security and sustainability, some things that can happen up front before two people move in together, is to write a formal roommate written agreement where each party understands what their obligations are. And that's not just financial obligations, but what are the rules of the household? You know, who's responsible for cleaning the kitchen to who's paying the utility bills, when are guests allowed in the home, kind of working through all of those things and putting them in writing before the two agree to rent together. Another thing that can be a possibility is having a conversation with the landlord that's willing to rent to two roommates. On occasion, we have had landlords that will allow for separate leases so that if one of the roommates falls off paying rent, not both parties will be evicted, but just the one, and a new roommate can come in to support the household.
So shared housing is, I think it's not a method that's used enough, but there's many benefits associated with using shared housing. As Diana said, there are financial benefits as far as there's a reduced rent burden, knowing that it does not all fall on you and your income, but also there's a pooled expenses for utilities. There's someone else that can assist the individual with taking care of the utilities. Maybe someone has arrears of utilities. They're not able to get electricity in their name or gas in their name, and that has been something that has been holding them up from getting their apartment and moving further. But if someone else is free and clear of that, then that can assist them. Also, having access to better neighborhoods. You're talking about two incomes versus one, so they can afford a unit that is in a better area. And then if someone lives with someone that they feel comfortable with, then they can assist with childcare as well as transportation. Maybe the other individual that someone's staying with, maybe they have a vehicle. So there's a lot of financial benefits, but there's also interpersonal benefits. Sometimes people don't feel comfortable or they're not yet ready to live alone. But if they have someone else that's living with them, that is a like built-in in-house support network. It reduces the isolation, knowing that they're not alone. There's someone else that's right there, possibly a room away. And it reduces stress, knowing that they have someone else that they can count on, that it doesn't all fall on them, and they have a built-in support system. As a provider, there are some provider benefits. There's a reduced length of stay. It reduces the length of stay, I'm sorry. And there's also a solution to battle low vacancy rates in high rent communities. There's a lot of times as a housing provider, you hear there's not enough housing stock right now, especially with landlords not really want to rent up because of the eviction moratorium. So there's not a lot of housing stock right now. But if you're able to house two individuals together, that just makes it better for the individual as well as a provider. And then with subsidy, it does also assist with the subsidy. A two-bedroom unit is lower cost than having to get two separate one-bedroom units. So there's a lot of benefits when it comes to shared housing. I know oftentimes people automatically think that they want their own apartment, but I encourage people to think outside the box, look at shared housing as an option, explore that. I'm sure if you present it to someone, most likely they'll be willing to take a shared housing situation over staying in their vehicle longer, or over staying on someone else's couch, or having to go into a shelter. So just consider that as another option when it comes to housing someone.
So we've talked a lot about what some housing possibilities are, some diversion outcomes, but I think it's important to note that when you're coming up with a housing stabilization plan, while we're remaining housing focused and housing needs to be the priority in our conversation, it is really helpful also to do some resource mapping in your community. So that's knowing what the other local resources are that you might be able to refer your client to that can help them provide them with, other action steps and some stability. Like we talked about, if they're going to be staying with family or friends temporarily, the family or friends are going to feel more comfortable if they know that other steps are being taken to resolve the crisis. So here's just like a sampling of some resources that you might want to search out in your community to know who the contacts are, what the locations are, what the phone numbers are, so that you have a resource guide that you can present to clients within your community to know where to go. So it's things like knowing where your local job center is, what the local temp agencies are, so that people can go and look for employment, what childcare options are. That can be a huge barrier to housing if, you know, the head of household is unable to work because of childcare limitations, having the Care for Kids application on hand for folks to fill out, knowing where your local substance abuse treatments centers are. There's a great hotline, and I've used this. I bring this up because this is one of my favorite stories in my experience in working in the field. The 24/7 DEMIS access line, and we've listed the 800 number here. I feel like there's often some hesitation and, well, that's not really going to work, or but really thinking about when somebody presents and saying, you know, today's the day that I want help, calling that number. I had a client that I worked with for a couple of years, had been addicted to heroin for 10 years straight. The day that she came to me and said, I want help, we called that access line together, and she ended up getting transportation to a facility that day. They came and picked her up. Not only did that happen, but her boyfriend came into the appointment at the same time, and he ended up going to the same facility. And she's been in recovery since that happened. So while I know that there are some issues with any of these referrals, really like taking a step back and thinking maybe today's the day that this is going to be the thing that changes somebody's life. So I'll get off my soapbox there a little bit, but I just want to, bring up some prime examples of these are referrals that can really help people. CTAddictionServices.com is another place that you can go to find open beds in detox facilities, treatment facilities, and sober homes. Knowing where your local adult education services are, who the contacts are, who the phone numbers are. Veteran services can be really helpful. They have a whole set of their own homeless response resources available to those veterans that are experiencing homelessness. Elderly protective services, knowing where to refer somebody for things like basic needs, clothing, hygiene. If they need a shower, they haven't had a shower in a few weeks, is there a local facility that you can refer them to where they can get access to showers? Many localities across the state have drop-in centers where people can go just to sit and be comfortable for a while. During the winter, we have within each can, we try to work out overflow options. So when the shelters are full, where people can go for that resource to get in out of the cold. Also, as I brought up before, your local McKinney-Vento contact, that is through your local Board of Education, to find out what services and supports might be available through the school system. So that's just a sampling of what some resources are that you might be able to look through your community to be able to refer people. At the very beginning of this presentation, we talked about the response system in the state of Connecticut, and that starts with 211. So somebody in housing crisis may have already called 211, but the 211 website in itself can also be a really great resource. You can type in the search engine on 211, whatever services or programs you're looking for, your zip code or your city, and hit search. And they are really great at keeping localities up to date on what services are available. So you can look specifically within your community to find out what's available. And I think this is also really great because It gives clients a tool that they can use in the privacy of, looking on their phone if they have availability, or going into a library and doing a search on their own. So it's kind of empowering for the client as well. Other places to connect for local resources, your local community services office, that might also be called a human services office, that's often located within your city hall office. Your local public library. Many folks that are experiencing literal homelessness are going to try to find a place to come in out of the cold, and a public library is a great place for them to do that. But the public library also is a wealth of knowledge of their local municipality and what's available. Your Department of Social Services, where people can go to apply for benefits, such as food stamps, temporary assistance for needy families, disability benefits, all of that. So knowing where to send somebody for those applications, or having those applications ready and on hand. Also, your local community action agency, that is a place that often times people can go to for things like utility assistance. Again, I understand, like, we're working through some really difficult times in this pandemic, and many of these offices are working virtually, but hopefully we'll be out of this sometime in the near future. And a lot of these offices have big bulletin boards and they post things, and that's a place that you can go for really up-to-date information and resources. So I want to shift now and talk just briefly about the flexible financial assistance that is available through the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness, and how your agency might be able to access those. We have been working with our agency. Years back, we began what's called our Be Homeful campaign, and that started out with some diversion assistance, flexible financial assistance, to help families and keep them from having to enter an emergency shelter, that was specific to heads of household with families under the age of 18. Within the past year and through the pandemic, we've opened up the flexible financial assistance funds that we have available. We now open that funding up not just to families, but to individuals. We have, within the past year, while it's not something that's readily available at the moment, but some rapid exit funding to keep shelter stays as short as possible. We also have our youth homelessness demonstration project that we're running. That is financial assistance that is ongoing, that is specific to the population that is 18 to 24 years old. Within our emergency assistance, again, we've opened up many of our funding to different populations. We now have a special collaboration with the Department of Corrections for those folks that are end of sentence within incarceration that would be entering the community to homelessness. Some financial assistance available to those folks from a referral from the Department of Corrections. So it's another project that we're really proud of, that is part of our emergency assistance funding. So in order to receive any kind of assistance for clients that you're working with, if you wanted to access any of CCEH's funding, what would be needed is that your agency must have a signed MOU with CCEH. That is, for those of you not familiar with the acronym, it's a memorandum of understanding. It's a contract that we both sign. Any staff that would be submitting a request would have to have attended a CCEH diversion training, and your agency would have to have access to the Homeless Management Information System database and the client records there. I wanted to give you just kind of a broad overview of what the allowable expenses are. And again, I'll keep this as brief as possible. In talking about diversion, when we're talking about financial assistance, we really, really try to encourage creative problem solving. I think I'm always trying to break the misconception that financial assistance has to be rental assistance, a security deposit, and first month's rent. There are many other ways that we can assist folks at the brink of homelessness and help them resolve their housing crisis if we just think outside the box. So there could be some assistance with utilities. It could be a rental application fee. It could be moving expenses. As Amber mentioned, we have a really exciting grant that we received from PetSmart. So if the barrier to housing is that there's a pet involved, and maybe a landlord's asking for an additional security deposit because of that, or there's some boarding or some vet bills, and we can say that those are directly related to the housing stabilization plan. We can use some funding to help with pet expenses. Other areas where we can be of assistance can be through transportation, car repairs, bus passes, anything from medical bills to childcare costs. The bottom line here is that when we provide financial assistance, and again, CCEH is not the only organization that you can go to for financial assistance. You may have some other organizations within your local area that also can help out. But really the bottom line is to think, is this cost directly related to the housing plan? Is this something that if we provide this one-time financial assistance or a short period of financial assistance, that is going to resolve the housing crisis and provide the household with some sustainability? So I want to shift a little bit to what happens when you've gone through all of this meaty conversation, you've had the problem solving conversation, you've really been client focused, you're taking into account client choice, and you've come to the end of the conversation and you really just can't come up with a diversion plan. So I don't want you to feel defeated in those cases. But what happens when diversion isn't possible? What are the next steps that you can take? What you should be doing is connecting the householder client to a coordinated access network outreach worker. So somebody that is versed in street outreach. That connection can happen, again, as we talked about the full system overview, through the call to 211 and the CAN assessment. Knowing who your outreach agencies are within your community can be helpful, in making those connections to folks that do outreach can be very helpful, so that you can work together with clients that are experiencing street homelessness. What's also really helpful in those instances is making sure that the client has a way to connect with you. Oftentimes people that are experiencing literal homelessness have trouble with keeping a phone, maintaining contact. So really trying to make sure that there's a way to connect. So do they have an email address? If they don't have an email address, can you help them create a Gmail account, which is free? Really thinking through some of those things to make sure that those people can stay connected to our system and connected to the services that can help them resolve their housing crisis. Email, text options, walk-in options. The client should never leave, especially a homeless service provider, the client should never leave an appointment feeling that calling 211 is the only way to connect back.
Okay, so we have provided you all with tons of information, but now we just want to hear from you. We want to provide you with some different scenarios and see how you're able to implement the different diversion practices that we spoke of. So there's going to be some different scenarios that we're going to have on the next few slides. And we want you to look at these scenarios and see if you can identify the strengths that a person has, also make a list of some of the clarifying questions that you would ask them. And then lastly, develop potential outcomes or plans for this person based on the information that they shared. So keep in mind that um, the actual practice that you will be taking into client choice. So it's not just, you coming up with a plan for them, but if you were to actually do this, client choice will be the most important. But for now, we're scenarios. And for the first one, I want you to specifically look at identifying the strengths. And then the second one, we're going to look at the clarifying questions. And then the third one, the outcomes. And if you can just put your responses, and you guys don't have the chat feature, but if you can put it in the questions box as you input them, I'll read it out and Diana will discuss the different scenarios further. So Diana, I'll let you start with the first scenario.
Thanks, Amber. And yeah, we just want to give you, like a chance to kind of put some of this into practice. So the scenario one, Sam is in his early 50s, so this is a sample client. He's been in and out of emergency shelter for the past 5 years since he was released from a 1-year incarceration. Sam's family has tried to help and take him in on a couch on several occasions, including a brother and a cousin that both live nearby, but it always ends in either verbal or physical dispute, and Sam is afraid of the police getting called. He's worked a few side jobs under the table for a friend that is a local mechanic, but nothing consistent. He has trouble finding work because of his felony background. Sam feels his only option now is to get back into shelter and await a voucher for housing. He has been sleeping outside in a park for the past month since the last time his brother kicked him out. Sam has missed his last 2 appointments that he scheduled through 211, but showed up today with all of his belongings in a backpack and looking very disheveled. He is embarrassed to admit he hasn't showered since leaving his brother's apartment. So what I'd like you to do is kind of think through this scenario and give us some options of what you think Sam's strengths are and how you can highlight those. I'll give you a couple minutes.
Okay, so far I don't see any strengths coming through. Oh, I see some. All right. So some strengths that are identified is that Sam has been able to locate work, that he seems to be resourceful, persistent. He has some mechanical skills. He has a support system. Let's see. He has some family contact. He has family in the area that has helped him in the past, and they may be willing to help him again. He has job skills. And something that someone else pointed out is that he's committed to staying out. He's still motivated and he's trying to find help and he's seeking services. So those are a lot of strengths that he has. Or we have more. He's left a bad situation, which is often the start to making some positive changes. And he has a family that keeps giving another chance for him.
Yeah, those are really great responses. I would point out that, even though he's missed 2 appointments through 211, he's still trying to get the assistance that he's advocating for himself. The family connections are awesome. His recognition that, he doesn't want the police to get involved with, his natural supports is really a benefit to his self-awareness. So there's a lot here to unpack. And I think when you're meeting with somebody and you're having these conversations, to really focus on, hey, Sam, I realize what you're going through, but I'm seeing some really positive things in in the conversation that we're having. So awesome job, everybody. All right, so we're going to move to scenario 2, and I'll read through that, and we're going to do the same thing, but this time I want you to think about what kind of clarifying questions you would want to ask Catherine. So Catherine and her 5-year-old daughter were displaced from the apartment that she was renting for the last 3 years following a fire in the building last week. Red Cross provided a $500 gift card, which she's used to pay for a hotel stay and has exhausted. Catherine was in the apartment at the time of the fire and is visibly trembling during her appointment as she describes the experience. Catherine has full-time employment at the local post office, but has not been back to work since the fire, nor has her daughter been to school. Catherine tells you that her only family is a sister that lives in the state, but she's an hour commute away from her. Her sister is willing to help, but doesn't know how. Catherine has been calling her landlord, but has not gotten any response. So what kind of questions would you want to ask Catherine that would lead to some action steps that might help in a housing resolution? And again, I'll give you a couple minutes.
All right, I'm just going to read them as they are coming through. One question is, what is keeping her from going to work or sending her child to school? Also, I have heard of a work program offered by the state for people with felonies where they pay the person's salary. I'm sorry, I don't think that's a question for Catherine. One second. I think that's
Sounds like a good
for us. We'll get to that question.
Sounds like a good option for resource mapping.
Right. Okay. A question for Catherine is, what do you think would help resolve your current housing situation? Yes. Do you want to call your sister with us? Also, can I assist you with making the call? Does she have any other contact information for her landlord so that you can assist with the call with the landlord? Asking her, has she been in contact with any, that didn't come in, anyone else in the system? Can you help to contact the post office? Have you reached out to the UPS people, the mail carriers? What is she considering as a solution? Get her choice in it. Has she considered mental health counseling or trauma assistance? So those are just some of the questions. Does she have any renter insurance?
Yeah, renter's insurance is a good one. And those are some really great questions. The reason I use this scenario, and I would like to highlight this one, it speaks to when a building is uninhabitable again. And so the scenario here describes a fire in an apartment building, but there are many reasons why an apartment building or unit might be uninhabitable or may even get to the point of the building being condemned. Red Cross is a great resource, and they do step in when there's fires, providing a gift card. When a client really doesn't have any other natural supports, you're going to see that they're using that gift card for a hotel, and it's going to really speak to the housing crisis. But I want to point out here, and again, I use this scenario because it's important to know that there are other services that should be available through your local municipality through fair housing when a condemnation or a building is uninhabitable. So reaching out to your city hall and finding out what those resources are can also be beneficial. So those are some of the questions that I would hope would be asked in this kind of situation. Did anybody ask anything about the daughter's school?
Yes, we did have a few asking if they, if Catherine would like assistance with contacting the school, or what's preventing her from her daughter going to school.
Yeah, so that's another resource that can be really helpful. The school system's local McKinney-Vento liaison. If Catherine decided to go and stay with her sister that is an hour away, can we keep her daughter in the school that she's been in and keep her some stability, and the schools can provide some transportation there. So that's just another resource that you should be aware of in your local community that can be part of the housing plan. All right, last scenario, and for this one, I'd like you to think about, again, trying to remember that you're trying to remain client-focused and client choice oriented. So Fred and Joy are a married couple that have been sleeping in their car for the last 5 months. They recently relocated from Maine after his father died and most of the family went their separate ways. Joy has a high school friend that she reconnected with on Facebook. She lives in Connecticut, and when she heard of the couple's circumstances, invited them to come and stay with her. However, upon arrival, the couple realized her living conditions were not healthy. There was mold and evidence of infestation in her small apartment. So the couple decided it was better to sleep in their car. They use a rest stop on occasion for showers. Joy suffers from bipolar disorder and is on disability benefits, receiving $771 a month. Fred has multiple injuries to his back and was in a serious motorcycle accident years ago with an injury to his head. He has trouble remembering small details and gets confused easily while answering assessment questions. Fred is applying for disability benefits as well. He has already applied 2 times and has been denied. He is in the appeal process. Both present at the time of their appointment with swollen legs and complaining of pain in their ankles and feet, making it difficult to get around. So I'll let you think for a couple of minutes and type your questions in.
Diana, can you just say what are they looking for this time for this question?
Some possibilities for a diversion outcome. So what's the housing plan that might be in place here?
Okay. All right, we have some rolling through. Someone says, tell them about the 211 system. They're asking if they have reached out to any Section 8 or low-income housing options. Now we have a little bit more clarifying questions where someone wants to know, does Fred's family know what his current situation is? And then we also want to see if the couple qualifies for any temporary shelter stay until a unit can be found in their price range. Someone suggests that they offer the emergency room. What medicines, health conditions do they have? Connect to Social Security, advocate to get assistance with the appeal. And just asking if is there anything that they need assistance with right away. Sign them up for low-income apartments. Do shared housing options with medical insurance and medical providers. See what options are available to them based off of their health insurance. Inquire a little bit about if their friend's place can be fixed up. Would they consider going back? There's so many outcomes. You guys are doing great with all of your.
You guys are really doing great. Yeah, absolutely. So some help with the infestation. Yeah, that could be a mitigating factor that, you know, if you could get that cleared up, could they go back with that friend? I love the questions about medical attention because and I use this scenario again as an example. This is a very common scenario for people that have been living in their car for any extended period of time. Swollen legs is a prime medical physical response to sleeping sitting up. So it can be dangerous. So making sure that they're connected in that way. Did anybody say anything about the family in Maine?
I do not see anything about the family in Maine. If someone did put that, I am sorry that I am overlooking it.
No, I just wanted
actually,
to bring
yes.
up like
Someone
Yeah,
did
go ahead.
ask if the family knows about the current situation. So
Yeah,
I'm
so
assuming they want to
some
reach out.
mediation,
Mhm.
even though the family kind of went their separate ways, there might be some family members that don't know that they've been sleeping in their car. So it's a great way to frame that, to pick up the phone and see if there might be some other supports that they've decided that they can't use, but maybe they actually could. So those are really great, and I appreciate the responses. Those are wonderful responses.
All right. So that actually concludes, and I know there has been several questions that has been coming throughout this training, and we just want to give enough time to go to those questions. But actually, one of the last ones that just came through about one of the scenarios was, um, would it be an option to ask for funds to return that last person, I forget the name, the family, to Maine?
So the way to start to think about trying to access those funds would be for the initial call to 211, attending a CAN assessment. The local homeless service providers that conduct that assessment would be the ones to access the funding if that were to be an option. But I really find that opening up that financial conversation, and I use this language often in these trainings, and that somebody that's in this traumatic housing crisis, um, the trauma of it can really shift the way someone's brain functions. So that problem solving conversation, when you're in that kind of like fight or flight mode, can be really difficult to do. When we can ease someone's stress level and someone's tension level to say that there might be a possibility that we could help out with that, it can kind of pull them out of that fight or flight and open up a more productive problem solving conversation. So that's a great point there.
Okay. We have another question about what is the time frame between the call to 211, a decision for a client to attend the assessment, and the decision if diversion is available?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we try to keep the call time or the scheduling of the appointment to a really quick turnaround. It varies uh, depending on where you're located in the state. I'll bring it back to pre-pandemic. We were having in-person appointments, and now all of those appointments are happening by phone. I believe on average statewide, it's 1 to 2 days to get scheduled for an assessment. So it should be relatively quickly. That changes again right now, being that we're doing all of the calls by phone, they're happening a little bit quicker. Post-pandemic, when we're doing those appointments in person, the time frame can change from time to time based on who is getting scheduled, what our no-show rates are. All of those are factors. The staffing capabilities of the providers based on the CAN region that you're in are all factors in that, but we try to keep those wait times as short as possible.
Great, thank you. Diana, we're getting a few questions about what if an individual doesn't have regular access to a telephone so that they can do the CAN assessment? Are there any creative strategies that you can give them?
Yeah, there's a lot of struggles that we're all dealing with now in this pandemic. You can apply for a state phone for the client. Having an address that the phone can be mailed to can be an issue. So that might be that they might have some natural supports that are willing to help, but they can't stay there, but maybe they can use that person's address to have the phone mailed. So that's an option. Making sure that they're set up with an email account, like I talked about, It's pretty simple and easy to help somebody, assist somebody in creating a Google email, a Gmail account. They can do that at their local public library. You can do that online with them. You know, when I was doing the work, I really, and not everybody has the same work style, so I appreciate, you know, you listening to me. I encourage people to drop in and say hi to me. That's not always going to work for, you know, your agency's work schedule or social distancing, making sure that we're following CDC guidelines and practicing safety during the pandemic. But for those folks that have state phones and have limited minutes, texting options can be really, really helpful. So if your agency has work cell phones, that can really be a really great way to have a quick and easy contact with people. So if you have the ability to text, I would encourage that as well.
Great, thank you. Another question is, you know, we've been talking about diversion, but there are times when diversion doesn't seem possible and someone may be connected to an outreach worker. But oftentimes, some of our clients don't necessarily know who their outreach worker is. They might not have the contact information. They may forget their name. Is there any type of database or a system that someone can go to, such as another provider, like a probation officer or someone else that's in the homeless response system, a way of accessing their information to see who their CAN outreach worker is?
Yeah, for those instances, what I would say, what I would encourage you to do is ask the client if you can call 211 with them. If they've touched our homeless response system in the past and they've kind of been in and out, and maybe they have had an outreach worker, if you're on the call with them and they're in agreement to that, you can ask the 211 call specialist. There should be case notes in our homeless management information system to say who they've been in contact with. There may be even contact information that's available there. But trying to stay connected with your local CAN providers is also another way to find that information, and you can find out who the contacts are right on our website. Amber, I think you might be able to speak to that, where they can find that on the CCH website.
Yes, if you go to resources, I'm sorry, you kind of caught me off guard. I was reading the other questions. But if you go to resources,
I'm sorry, I'm throwing you there. Out there.
They'll be listed on our website. I can also send that information out as a follow-up at the end of this training.
Yeah, that would be perfect.
Okay. Let's see. There's a few last questions that came through, not too many. So if you do have any last questions, we have about 2 minutes left. Feel free to enter them. I will respond back to several questions as far as, will the slides be available? Yes, they will be. They'll be available, as well as the training recording. They will be on our website at www.cceh.org. If you go to our resource tab, you will see the next tab will be webinars, and they will be listed there. So if you give me I will try by the end of this week, if not by Monday, it will be listed there. And that is actually all of our questions. So Diana,
thank you for spending. Thank you for spending this 2 hours with us and learning about shelter diversion. Please feel free to reach out to us after the training if you come up with further questions or other things that we might be able to assist you with.
Yes, thank you. Our contact information is on the screen. You can reach out to Diana for shelter diversion related information. If you have any other questions about training, maybe some training needs that you have, or webinars that we may have, you can contact me at training@cceh.org. And thank you, Diana, for joining me. Thank you all for joining us on this cold, snowy day. And I hope that you all have a nice, warm, safe day. So take care.
Thanks, Amber.
Thanks. Bye-bye.